My father dismissed my writing as a phase at my birthday dinner. The publisher at the next table overheard, approached our table, and revealed, "A phase? He's the best-selling author we've been negotiating with anonymously." The fork I was holding clattered against my plate when the woman in the navy blazer stood up from the table behind us. I'd noticed her earlier, sitting alone with a glass of wine and a leather portfolio, the kind of professional presence that blends into upscale restaurant backgrounds. But now she was walking toward our table with the kind of purposeful stride that made my stomach drop, and I knew exactly who she was before she opened her mouth. My father had just finished his third glass of scotch and was mid-sentence in his annual birthday speech about how I needed to stop wasting my life on scribbling stories and get a real job. The same speech he'd been giving since I was 23, now recycled for my 30th birthday, with updated statistics about how few writers actually make money and how my English degree was gathering dust while I lived in a studio apartment and worked retail. He'd said the word phase twice already, once with air quotes that made my mother wince and my younger brother look at his phone to avoid eye contact. Then this woman appeared at our table, and the expression on her face was somewhere between amused and furious. I'd been writing seriously for 8 years when that birthday dinner happened, since I graduated from college with a degree in English literature that my father called a waste of tuition money. My name is Andrew Westfield, and for most of my adult life, I'd been living a double existence that nobody in my family knew about. By day, I worked at a bookstore in downtown Seattle, a job my father considered proof that my writing aspirations were delusional. By night and on weekends, I wrote novels under the pen name J.R. Blackwood, a deliberate choice that obscured my gender and identity. I'd published my first book through a small independent press 3 years ago, a psychological thriller that sold moderately well, but didn't make waves. My second book, published 2 years later through a larger publisher, hit the New York Times bestseller list and stayed there for 18 weeks. My third book, which had been out for 6 months, was currently sitting at number 4 on that same list and had sold over 200,000 copies. The advance for my fourth book, which I'd just signed contracts for 3 weeks before this birthday dinner, was $450,000. My father thought I made $11 an hour shelving books and probably lived on ramen. The decision to keep my writing career secret from my family had been deliberate and complicated. It started as self-protection, a way to avoid my father's criticism while I was still trying to figure out if I could actually make this work. Richard Westfield, my father, was a corporate attorney who'd built his entire identity around professional success and financial stability. He'd wanted me to go to law school, follow in his footsteps, join his firm eventually. When I chose English literature instead, he'd been disappointed, but told himself I'd come to my senses eventually, maybe get an MBA, or at least go into publishing on the business side. When I graduated and announced I wanted to write novels, his disappointment turned to active disdain. He made it clear he considered creative writing a hobby, not a career, something people did in their spare time after establishing themselves in real professions. So when my first book got accepted for publication, I didn't tell him. I told myself it was because I wanted to prove I could succeed before dealing with his skepticism. But really, it was because I couldn't handle the idea of him dismissing something I'd worked so hard for. The pen name helped. J.R. Blackwood didn't exist publicly beyond book covers and author bios that mentioned a reclusive writer who preferred privacy. No author photos, no social media presence, no book tours or publicity appearances. My publisher hadn't loved this approach initially, but my agent, a woman named Rebecca Thornhill who'd been representing me for 5 years, had argued that mystery sold books and that plenty of successful authors maintained privacy. She'd negotiated contracts that protected my anonymity, handled all public-facing aspects of the career, and became one of only 3 people who knew that J.R. Blackwood was actually Andrew Westfield, a 30-year-old guy who worked at a bookstore and lived in a rent-controlled studio his father thought was evidence of failure. The other 2 people who knew were my accountant, Leonard Kushner, who handled the taxes on my writing income, and my publisher's main contact, the woman who was now standing at our birthday table looking at my father like he was something she'd scraped off her shoe. Her name was Victoria Ashford, senior editor at Meridian House Publishing, the 3rd largest publishing house in the United States. I'd met her exactly twice in person, both times at her office in New York for contract discussions, always scheduled around my father's business trips, so there was no chance of running into him. She was 52 years old, with silver-streaked black hair cut in a sharp bob, expensive glasses, and the kind of presence that made junior editors stand up straighter when she walked past. She'd edited all 3 of my published books and was slated to edit the 4th, and she'd been trying to convince me for 2 years to reveal my identity publicly because she believed it would boost sales even further. I'd refused every time because the thought of my father finding out about my success and trying to claim credit or involvement made my skin crawl. Now she was standing at our table at Ray's Boathouse, one of Seattle's nicest waterfront restaurants, where my father had insisted on celebrating my birthday because he wanted to be seen at expensive places that reflected well on his status, and she'd apparently heard every word of his dismissive speech. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Victoria said, and her voice had that crisp East Coast accent that marked her as someone who'd grown up with money and education, but I couldn't help overhearing your conversation about writing careers. She looked directly at my father, ignoring the rest of us. "You're Richard Westfield, aren't you? I've seen your name on legal documents. You handle corporate contracts for several publishing companies." My father looked momentarily thrown by being recognized, then pleased because being known meant being important. That's correct. I specialize in intellectual property and publishing law. And you are? Victoria smiled, but it wasn't friendly. Victoria Ashford, senior editor at Meridian House. I'm actually here in Seattle to finalize a major book deal, and I happen to be having dinner while reviewing contracts. She glanced at me, and I saw the question in her eyes, asking permission. I should have shaken my head, should have found a way to signal that I didn't want this, but I couldn't move. Part of me had been waiting for this moment for years, and another part was terrified of what would happen next. My father recovered his composure and launched into networking mode, the personality he deployed at professional functions. Meridian House, impressive. I've reviewed several of your standard contracts, actually. Good to meet someone from the editorial side. This is my son Andrew. It's his 30th birthday. We were just discussing his career plans. He said it with that subtle emphasis that suggested my career plans were laughable, and I watched Victoria's expression harden. Yes, I heard. You were saying something about writing being a phase? My father laughed, the indulgent sound he made when discussing topics he considered beneath serious attention. Andrew's been writing stories since he was a kid. He's talented. I'll give him that. But talent doesn't pay bills. He's been working retail for years now, living in a tiny apartment, convinced he's going to be the next Stephen King. I keep telling him it's time to face reality, get a real career, maybe go back to school for something practical. He's 30 now. Can't keep chasing fantasies forever. My mother, Catherine, put her hand on my father's arm in a gesture I recognized as her trying to soften his words, but she didn't contradict him. She never did. My brother, David, who was 26 and worked in tech exactly like our father wanted, looked uncomfortable, but stayed silent. Victoria pulled out her phone, tapped the screen a few times, and then turned it to show my father something. That's interesting because I'm currently negotiating with a writer whose last book sold over 200,000 copies and whose next book we just offered $450,000 for. Best-selling author, actually. 3 books on the New York Times list. Movie rights sold for the 2nd book, production starting next year. I'd hardly call that a fantasy career. My father looked at the phone screen, politely interested but not connecting any dots. That's wonderful for them, but that's exactly my point. Success like that is incredibly rare. For every one writer who makes it, there are thousands who waste years trying and failing. Andrew's a smart kid, but he's not realistic about his chances. Victoria's smile got sharper. What if I told you that the author I'm describing, the one we're paying nearly $500,000 for their next book, is sitting at this table right now? There was a moment of confused silence. My mother looked at me with a strange expression, hope and disbelief mixing together. David actually put down his phone. My father frowned, clearly thinking Victoria was making some kind of rhetorical point that he wasn't following. I'm not following, my father said slowly, and I could see him getting annoyed at being confused in front of someone he'd been trying to impress 30 seconds ago. Victoria looked directly at me. Andrew, I think it's time. You've protected your privacy long enough, but your father deserves to know the truth about your phase. She emphasized the word with the same contempt my father had used. I felt my throat close up, my hands starting to shake under the table where nobody could see them. This was it, the moment I'd been avoiding for years, the confrontation I'd structured my entire career to prevent. I could deny it, could claim Victoria had me confused with someone else, could maintain the secret and deal with the awkwardness later. But looking at my father's face, at the dismissive certainty that I was a failure wasting my life, something snapped inside me. I was tired of hiding, tired of letting him believe the worst, tired of protecting him from the reality that I'd succeeded without his help or approval. The author Victoria's talking about, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected, is me. I've been publishing under the pen name J.R. Blackwood for 3 years. My books have sold over 300,000 copies combined. I made $230,000 last year from writing, not counting the advance for my next book. The studio apartment you think proves I'm failing? I could afford a house. I choose to live there because the rent is cheap and I'm investing the rest. I'm not working retail because I can't get a better job. I work there because I like it and because it's flexible enough to let me write full-time around it. Everything you think about my life is wrong. The silence that followed was the kind that feels physical, like the air pressure in the room changed. My mother's hand went to her mouth. David's eyes went wide, and my father's face went through a series of expressions, confusion, disbelief, realization, and then something that looked almost like anger. I'd been building toward this moment without knowing it for 8 years. Every choice I'd made about my career designed to avoid my father's judgment while simultaneously proving him wrong. It started in college when I took creative writing workshops, and my father called them impractical, waste of tuition that he was paying for. He'd wanted me taking business courses, pre-law classes, things that would set me up for a serious career. When I'd shown him the first short story I'd published in a literary magazine, he'd glanced at it and said, "That was nice," but didn't pay anything. When I'd graduated and told him I wanted to pursue writing seriously, he'd given me 6 months to get it out of my system before he expected me to apply to law schools. That 6-month deadline came and went while I worked at the bookstore and wrote my first novel in the early mornings before my shifts. My father started making comments at family dinners about when I was going to grow up and get serious about my future. My mother tried to be supportive, but in a vague way that suggested she also thought writing was a long shot. David, who'd gotten his computer science degree and immediately landed a job at Microsoft, became the golden child by default, the son who'd made practical choices and had a real career. The first rejection letters for my first novel hurt less than my father's dismissiveness. At least agents and editors were honest about why they passed, gave me feedback I could use to improve. My father just made sweeping pronouncements about how the arts weren't viable careers, and I was wasting my 20s. When I finally got an offer from a small press for that first novel, I made the decision not to tell him. I told myself it was because the advance was only $3,000, and he'd just use that as proof that writing didn't pay. Really, it was because I couldn't stand the idea of him patronizing me, patting me on the head, and saying that was a nice hobby project before returning to his narrative about my failure to launch. So J.R. Blackwood was born, a name I'd pulled from a character in a book I'd loved as a teenager, and my grandmother's maiden name. I created an email address, a P.O. box for mail, and an entire separate identity that existed only on paper and in publishing contracts. Rebecca, my agent, thought it was excessive, but understood when I explained that my family situation made public identity complicated. The second book changed everything financially, but not in ways my family could see. When it hit the bestseller list, when the advance for the third book jumped to 6 figures, when the movie rights sold for $250,000, I kept going to work at the bookstore because I genuinely enjoyed it. I liked talking to customers about books, liked the employee discount, liked the routine, and the co-workers who knew nothing about my writing career. I kept living in my studio apartment because it was rent-controlled at $900 a month in a city where average rent was 3 times that, and because moving to a nicer place would require explanations to my family about where the money came from. I invested most of my writing income, kept my expenses low, and maintained the appearance of struggling that my father expected. It was exhausting and dishonest, and probably said something unflattering about my relationship with my family, but it was also the only way I knew how to protect something that mattered to me from someone who would have found a way to diminish it. The birthday dinner was my mother's idea, the same as every year. She'd made the reservation at Ray's Boathouse 2 weeks in advance, invited just family because my father didn't believe in big friend celebrations for adults. It was supposed to be a nice evening, good food, maybe some thoughtful gifts, the annual ritual of family connection. Instead, it had turned into another intervention about my life choices, my father's favorite topic once he'd had a few drinks. He'd started with subtle digs during appetizers about how 30 was a milestone age, time to take stock and make changes. During the main course, he'd escalated to direct criticism about my job, my apartment, my apparent lack of ambition. And then during dessert, while the server was bringing out a chocolate cake with 30 candles that felt mocking under the circumstances, my father had launched into the speech about phases and reality and how I needed to stop pretending I was going to be a writer and start building an actual future. My mother had tried to redirect the conversation twice, suggesting we talk about something more pleasant on my birthday. David had attempted to change the subject to his new project at work. But my father was on a roll, energized by scotch and his own certainty, and he'd kept going until Victoria Ashford had heard enough and decided to intervene. Now, everyone at the table was staring at me like I'd announced I was secretly a spy or a prince in hiding. My father's face had gone through the initial shock and was settling into skepticism. "That's not possible," he said flatly. "If you were making that kind of money, you wouldn't be living in a studio apartment and working retail. You'd have a car, a house, you'd be living differently." I pulled out my phone, opened my email, and found the most recent message from Rebecca. It was the contract summary for my 4th book, showing the advance amount, the royalty percentages, the delivery deadlines. I handed the phone to my father without saying anything. He read it, his expression getting more confused and then angry. "This says J.R. Blackwood. That's not your name." Victoria, still standing at our table like an avenging angel in a business suit, laughed without humor. "It's his pen name, Mr. Westfield. Many authors use them, for privacy or marketing reasons. Andrew chose to keep his writing career separate from his personal life, which, given this conversation, I completely understand." My father scrolled through more emails, seeing the correspondence between me and Rebecca, between me and Victoria, seeing royalty statements and sales figures and contract negotiations. His face was getting red, the way it did when opposing counsel made an argument that undermined his case. "Why would you hide this? Why would you let us think you were failing?" It was the first real question he'd asked, not rhetorical or dismissive, and I felt something crack in my chest. "Because you made it clear from the beginning that you didn't respect writing as a career. Because every time I tried to talk about my work, you shut me down or made jokes about starving artists. Because I couldn't stand the thought of you patronizing me or claiming credit for my success, or finding some way to make it about you instead of about what I'd accomplished. So I just didn't tell you. I built a career you knew nothing about, and it was easier than dealing with your judgment." My mother made a small, wounded sound. David was reading something on his phone, probably Googling J.R. Blackwood to confirm I wasn't lying. My father set my phone down on the table carefully, like he was afraid he might throw it. "I've been worried about you for years," he said, and his voice was different now, quieter and strained. "Your mother calls me at work, concerned that you can't make rent. that you're living paycheck to paycheck. We've been discussing whether to offer you money, whether to stage an intervention about your life choices, and you've been making six figures the whole time? I felt anger flash through me, hot and sharp. You've been worried? You've spent years telling me I'm wasting my life, that I'm delusional, that I need to give up on my dreams and do something practical. That's not worry, that's control. You wanted me to fail so you could be right, so you could push me into the career you wanted for me. And when I succeeded despite you, in a way you couldn't see or measure or take credit for, you just assumed I was failing because that fit your narrative better. My mother reached for my hand across the table. Andrew, we didn't know. If you'd just told us. I pulled my hand back. I tried telling you. For years I tried explaining that I was serious about writing, that it mattered to me, that I was working towards something. And every time, Dad shut me down. Made it clear that unless I was doing what he wanted, making money in ways he respected, I was wasting my time. So I stopped trying to get your approval and just did it anyway. Victoria cleared her throat, reminding us she was still standing there witnessing this family implosion. I should get back to my table. Andrew, we have a meeting scheduled for tomorrow at 3 to discuss the marketing strategy for Book 4. Given recent developments, we might want to talk about finally doing some publicity, maybe revealing your identity more broadly. Your readers deserve to know who you are. She looked at my father one more time. Mr. Westfield, your son is one of the most talented writers I've worked with in 20 years of publishing. His books are smart, complex, and emotionally resonant. He's built a career through talent and hard work, without connections or shortcuts. You should be proud of him instead of trying to make him into something he's not. She walked back to her table, leaving silence behind her that felt like a crater. The other diners around us were trying not to stare, but definitely listening. Our server approached cautiously to ask if we wanted anything else, and my father waved him away with more force than necessary. The birthday cake sat in the middle of the table with 30 candles melting into the frosting, nobody touching it. My father picked up his scotch glass, realized it was empty, and set it back down. I need you to understand something, he said, and his lawyer voice was back, controlled and precise. Everything I've said, every push toward practical career choices, was because I wanted you to have stability and security. I've seen too many people chase dreams that never materialize, end up in their 40s with nothing to show for it. I was trying to protect you from that. I met his eyes across the table. By telling me I was failing? By dismissing everything I cared about? That's not protection. That's sabotage. You weren't trying to help me. You were trying to make me give up, because my choices made you uncomfortable. Because if I could succeed doing something you didn't value, it meant your definition of success might not be the only valid one. The accusation hung between us, and I watched my father process it. He was a smart man, successful in his field, good at arguing his position. But he was also stubborn and not used to being challenged, especially not by his children. I could see him wanting to argue back, to defend his actions and intentions, but Victoria's intervention had shaken his certainty. The evidence was irrefutable. I had succeeded dramatically in exactly the field he'd told me was impractical. My mother tried to salvage the evening. Can we please just have cake and celebrate Andrew's birthday? We can talk about all this later, at home, when everyone's calmer. But the dinner was already ruined, the illusion of family harmony shattered. David excused himself to the bathroom, probably to escape the tension. My father sat rigid in his chair, staring at the contract details on my phone screen like they were evidence in a case he was losing. I felt exhausted suddenly, the adrenaline of the confrontation fading into something heavier. This was what I'd been avoiding for years, the moment when my carefully separated lives collided and everyone had to deal with the truth. I'd imagined it would feel triumphant, proving my father wrong, showing him I'd succeeded without his support. Instead, it just felt sad and wasteful, all these years of distance and dishonesty, because we couldn't talk to each other honestly. The rest of the dinner passed in awkward fragments. David came back from the bathroom, and we cut the cake nobody wanted, made small talk about nothing important, avoided looking at each other directly. The server brought the check, and my father grabbed it before I could, paying with his corporate credit card like he always did, maintaining that small piece of control. We walked out to the parking lot separately, my parents in one direction, David and I in another. My mother hugged me goodbye and whispered that we needed to talk soon. Really talk. David looked at me with something like awe and said he'd been reading my book reviews on his phone, and they were impressive. My father shook my hand, formal and stiff, and said we'd discuss this further when emotions weren't running so high. Then they drove away in their luxury sedan, and I sat in my 12-year-old Toyota that I'd kept because it ran fine, and I didn't need anything flashier, and I felt like I'd just survived a car accident. I drove home to my studio apartment, the one my father thought was evidence of failure, and sat on my couch surrounded by the material evidence of my actual life. My laptop where I'd written 3 best-selling novels and was halfway through the 4th. The bookshelves crammed with research materials and favorite authors. The framed award certificates I'd never shown anyone, hidden in a closet because I didn't want to explain them. The bank statements showing investment accounts and savings that would let me retire before 40 if I wanted to. I'd built this life deliberately, carefully, protecting it from scrutiny and judgment, and now the walls were down. My family knew the truth, Victoria knew they knew, and there was no going back to the careful separation I'd maintained for years. I should have felt relieved, unburdened. Instead, I felt exposed and uncertain about what came next. The phone calls started the next morning. My mother first, at 8 a.m., wanting to meet for coffee to talk. Then Rebecca, my agent, who Victoria had apparently contacted immediately after the dinner to explain what happened. Rebecca was concerned about privacy breaches and contract implications, but also excited about potential publicity opportunities. Then David, asking if we could get lunch because he had questions about my writing process and career. I ignored most of them, spent the morning trying to work on my manuscript and failing to concentrate, then drove to Victoria's hotel for our 3 p.m. meeting, feeling like I was heading into another confrontation. Victoria was professional and direct, laid out options for how to handle my now compromised anonymity. We could maintain the pen name, but acknowledge my real identity in select interviews. We could transition to publishing under my real name. We could continue as before and hope my father kept quiet, though Victoria doubted that would happen. We were discussing marketing strategies when my phone rang with a call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost sent it to voicemail, but something made me answer. The voice on the other end was male, professional, introducing himself as Douglas Reinhardt, a journalist for a Seattle newspaper. He said he'd received an interesting tip about J.R. Blackwood's real identity and wanted to confirm some details before running a story. My stomach dropped. "Who gave you this information?" Douglas hedged, said he couldn't reveal sources, but indicated it had come from someone with direct knowledge of the situation. Someone who'd been at Ray's boathouse last night and overheard the conversation at my table. Not Victoria, not my family, but another diner who'd recognized the story's value and called it in. The price of having a public confrontation in a restaurant full of witnesses. I told Douglas I couldn't confirm anything without talking to my agent and publisher first, and ended the call. Victoria's expression had gone grim. "It's out then. Once one journalist has it, others will follow. We need to get ahead of this, control the narrative before someone else does." The next 3 days were a crash course in publicity crisis management. Rebecca flew to Seattle. We met with Meridian House's publicity team via video conference. We crafted an official statement revealing my identity, explaining the pen name as a privacy choice rather than deception. We scheduled interviews with major publications, negotiated photo shoots, planned a social media strategy for an author who'd never had public accounts. It was overwhelming and exhausting, and through all of it, I kept thinking about my father and whether he'd leaked the information deliberately or whether we'd just been unlucky with witnesses. I called him on the second day, asked directly if he'd talked to any journalists. He was offended by the question, insisted he would never compromise my privacy that way, regardless of our disagreements. I believed him, because for all his faults, my father took confidentiality seriously in his legal practice and wouldn't violate it in his personal life. Which meant some stranger at the restaurant had recognized a good story and sold it without caring about the consequences. The article came out 3 days after my birthday dinner, front page of the Seattle newspaper's arts section. Local bookstore employee revealed as best-selling mystery author J.R. Blackwood. It was actually a good piece, well-researched, with quotes from Victoria and Rebecca praising my work. Douglas had even tracked down reviews and sales figures, documented my rise from small press to major bestseller. The article mentioned my family's reaction at the birthday dinner in vague terms, suggested there had been surprise but didn't include details about my father's dismissive comments or the confrontation. I was grateful for that small mercy. But the story spread fast. Within hours, it was picked up by publishing industry blogs. By the next day, national entertainment sites were running versions. My publisher's publicity team was fielding interview requests from major media outlets. The privacy I'd guarded for years evaporated in 72 hours, and suddenly J.R. Blackwood had a face and a name and a backstory that people found compelling. The family fallout was more complicated. My mother wanted to have a big dinner where we could all talk through everything properly, clear the air, move forward. David thought the whole situation was fascinating from a marketing perspective and kept sending me articles about author branding strategies. My father remained silent for a week, then sent me an email. It was formal, carefully worded, the kind of communication he'd send to a client rather than his son. He acknowledged that his approach to my career had been dismissive and harmful. He said he'd been operating from assumptions rather than facts, and he regretted not taking my work seriously sooner. He said he was proud of what I'd accomplished, though the words felt stiff and obligatory. The email ended with a suggestion that we meet in person to discuss things properly, when I was ready. I didn't respond immediately because I didn't know what to say. An email apology felt insufficient for years of belittlement, but I also recognized it was probably difficult for my father to admit he'd been wrong about anything. The publicity around my revealed identity had unexpected effects on my career. Sales of all 3 books jumped significantly, as readers who'd heard about J.R. Blackwood, but never tried the books, decided to check out the author who'd worked at a bookstore while secretly being a bestseller. The movie production company accelerated their timeline for my second book's adaptation, wanting to capitalize on the publicity. My publisher moved up the release date for Book 4, scheduled additional print runs, arranged a book tour that I'd previously refused. Rebecca negotiated a new contract for Books 5 and 6, with an even larger advance. Suddenly, I wasn't just a successful author. I was a successful author with a compelling backstory, and the publishing industry loves a compelling backstory. It felt surreal and overwhelming, watching my carefully private career become public property, seeing my face on author websites and social media profiles, doing interviews where I had to discuss my writing process and inspiration instead of letting the work speak for itself. The bookstore where I worked became a minor tourist destination for readers who wanted to meet the author who'd been shelving their books. My manager, Patricia Nguyen, who'd known about my writing but not the extent of my success, was amused and supportive, but also had to set boundaries about disruptions to business. We agreed I'd work fewer hours, do occasional signing events at the store, and maintain some presence because I genuinely didn't want to quit. The job had been grounding, a connection to normal life that I valued. But the dynamics had changed. Co-workers who'd seen me as just another employee now treated me differently, with a mix of respect and awkwardness. Customers recognized me and wanted to talk about my books. The simplicity I'd valued was gone, another casualty of exposure. I cut my hours to 2 shifts a week, enough to maintain connection without it becoming a spectacle, and tried to adjust to my new reality, where privacy was a memory and my writing career was public knowledge. A month after the birthday dinner, I finally agreed to meet my father for coffee. We chose a neutral location, a cafe neither of us frequented, and sat across from each other with the kind of careful distance people maintain when they're not sure what the relationship is anymore. My father looked tired, older than I remembered. He ordered black coffee and got straight to the point. I owe you more than an email apology. What I said at your birthday dinner, what I've been saying for years, was wrong and hurtful. I let my own narrow definition of success blind me to what you were actually accomplishing. I made assumptions instead of asking questions, and I damaged our relationship in the process. The apology sounded more genuine in person, less formal than the email version. I sipped my coffee and waited to see if there was more. I've been thinking a lot about why I reacted the way I did, my father continued. I think part of it was fear. I'd built my entire life around a specific kind of achievement, and when you chose something different, it felt like a rejection of everything I valued. And when you succeeded at it, it threatened my belief system, made me question whether I'd been wrong about what matters. The vulnerability was unexpected and probably difficult for him. My father wasn't someone who admitted uncertainty or questioned his choices. I appreciate the apology, I said carefully. But I need you to understand that this isn't just about the birthday dinner. It's about years of you treating my passion like it was a character flaw, my work like it was a waste of time. You made me feel like I had to hide my success from you because you'd made it clear you wouldn't respect it unless it fit your definition of achievement. That does damage. That doesn't get fixed with one conversation. My father nodded slowly. I know. I'm not asking for immediate forgiveness or pretending one apology erases years of mistakes. I'm asking if we can start rebuilding from here, if you're willing to try. I thought about it, about whether I wanted to put in the effort to repair a relationship that had been broken for so long. Part of me wanted to stay angry, to hold on to the hurt as protection. But another part remembered that my father had been present in other ways, had paid for my education even when he disagreed with my choices, had shown up to family events and tried to be involved in my life, even if his involvement came with criticism. I'm willing to try, I said. But it has to be different going forward. You have to respect my choices even when they don't make sense to you. You have to accept that I'm successful in my own way, not your way. And you have to stop trying to control or judge my life path based on what you think I should be doing. My father agreed, promised to do better, and we spent the next hour talking about neutral topics and carefully rebuilding basic communication. It wasn't comfortable or easy, but it was a start. We agreed to have regular lunches once a month to work on the relationship without the pressure of larger family gatherings. As I drove home afterward, I felt cautiously optimistic that maybe the forced exposure had created an opportunity for honest connection that the secrecy had prevented. Maybe my father couldn't have respected my success when he didn't know it existed, but now that he did, maybe we could find a new equilibrium. The relationship with my family evolved slowly over the following months. My mother became my biggest supporter, bought copies of all my books for her friends, organized a book club specifically to read my novels. She apologized repeatedly for not defending me more forcefully against my father's criticism, said she'd always believed in my talent, but hadn't been brave enough to stand up to her husband. David and I got closer, bonded over discussions about creative work and career choices. He admitted he'd always envied my willingness to pursue something I was passionate about instead of defaulting to practical choices. My father kept his promises about monthly lunches, slowly learned to ask about my writing without undermining it, even read my books and offered thoughtful feedback that suggested he was genuinely trying. The relationship would never be easy or uncomplicated, but it was more honest than it had been in years. The forced revelation had burned away the polite lies we'd all been maintaining, and what grew back was more authentic, even if it was sometimes uncomfortable. My writing career continued its upward trajectory. Book 4 came out 6 months after my identity was revealed and debuted at #1 on the bestseller list, stayed there for 12 weeks. The publicity around my dual identity as bookstore employee and best-selling author captured public imagination in a way the anonymous pen name never had. I did interviews, appeared at literary festivals, built a social media presence that connected readers to my actual personality rather than the mysterious J.R. Blackwood persona. It was exhausting and exhilarating, watching my work reach audiences it never would have reached if I'd stayed hidden. Rebecca said the reveal added an estimated $2 million to my career earnings over the next 5 years, that readers loved the underdog story of the struggling writer who was actually successful all along. Victoria called it the best accidental marketing campaign she'd ever seen, said my sales numbers had exceeded even her optimistic projections. The studio apartment became a point of media fascination. Journalists wanted to photograph the tiny space where I'd written bestsellers. Readers wanted to know why I still lived there when I could afford much better. I explained in interviews that I'd kept it because it was paid for and comfortable, and because changing my living situation felt like giving in to external pressure about what success should look like. But eventually, the attention became too much. Fans started showing up at my building, neighbors complained about disturbances, and my landlord politely suggested I might want to find somewhere with better security. I moved to a small house in a quiet neighborhood, nothing extravagant, just enough space for a dedicated writing office and some privacy. I kept the furniture from my studio apartment because it was familiar and functional, decorated in a way that felt like me rather than like someone's idea of how a successful author should live. The house was mine, purchased outright with writing income, a tangible marker of success that I'd earned without anyone's help. A year after the birthday dinner revelation, Meridian House threw a publication party for my 5th book at a literary venue in Seattle. They invited local authors, publishing industry people, journalists, and bookstore owners. My family came, all of them, even my father, who looked uncomfortable in a room full of creative types but showed up anyway. Victoria gave a speech about my career trajectory, mentioned the unusual circumstances of my identity reveal, made a joke about birthday dinners that got knowing laughs from people who'd followed the story. Rebecca talked about representing me from the beginning, watching my talent develop, navigating the challenges of protecting my privacy while building my career. And then they asked me to say a few words, and I stood in front of a room full of people who knew my name and my work and my strange backstory, and I talked about what writing meant to me. I said writing had always been the way I made sense of the world, that it was never a hobby or a phase, but a fundamental part of who I was. I said I'd hidden behind a pen name and secrecy because I was afraid that exposure would destroy something precious, but that being forced into the light had actually made my work stronger and more honest. I thanked Victoria and Rebecca for believing in my books when they were just manuscripts from an unknown writer. And then I looked at my father, standing near the back of the room with my mother and brother, and I said that sometimes the people who challenge us the most end up teaching us important lessons about standing up for what we believe in, even when it's difficult. After the party, my father approached me with my mother and brother in tow. He looked emotional in a way I rarely saw, his usual composure cracked. "I'm proud of you," he said, and this time it sounded real rather than obligatory. "Not just because you're successful, though you are, but because you stayed true to what mattered to you even when I was telling you it was foolish. That takes courage I'm not sure I've ever had." My mother hugged me, crying happy tears, saying she knew all along I'd prove everyone wrong. David gave me one of those awkward bro hugs and said he was telling everyone at Microsoft that his brother was a best-selling author. We stood together as a family for what felt like the first time in years, the pretense and judgment stripped away, left with just the messy reality of people who were related and trying to connect despite their differences. It wasn't perfect, probably never would be, but it was honest, and that was enough. The movie adaptation of my 2nd book premiered the following year. I attended with my family, watched my words and characters translated into a visual medium that reached millions of people who would never read the book. My father sat through the entire thing without checking his phone once, then told me afterward that he finally understood why people connected with my stories. My mother cried during the emotional scenes and announced to strangers in the lobby that her son wrote it. David documented the whole premiere on social media like it was a personal achievement, and I sat in that theater watching my imagination projected on a screen, surrounded by family who finally saw me clearly and felt grateful for the birthday dinner confrontation that had forced us all to stop pretending. Sometimes exposure is painful, but sometimes it's necessary for truth to emerge. My father's dismissiveness had hurt for years, but Victoria's intervention had created space for honesty that our family had been avoiding. The phase he'd mocked had become a career he could finally respect, and in the process, we'd all learned something about the difference between appearances and reality. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.